right. Hey, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back. There's still like a couple minutes until 9 a.m. But for now, I'm just getting the stream established, and I'll get started in a few moments. But good to be with you guys. Hope everything's going well. Elif, Stephen, Eloise, good to see you guys. Hello, welcome back. Hey there. Cool. Hello, Jian, Kylie. Always nice to get the day started with you guys, so thanks. As you guys may know, we have some live students here. This is why now I have a mask, so I don't think it makes much of a difference. In my 10 a.m. class, there's been some students going, and so I've learned to kind of project my voice a little bit more to get past the muffling of the mask. But anyway, good morning, Alex. Good to see you too. Amanda, Grant, hey there. And yeah, same with you guys. You can ask, of course, like questions and using your voice and raise your hand, but you can also, to support the live stream, type a comment as well so that they get a record of it. And it's pretty straightforward. Hey there, Dimitri, Nicole, Nina, Brian. Okay, welcome everyone. All right, so we're pretty much now to 9 a.m. I'm gonna get things back in order. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much. It's Wednesday, 21st of April. And what we're doing is we're just gonna continue to develop more of our notes on this new topic of the philosophy of mind. So we were halfway or somewhat midway through the presentation of Descartes' sixth meditation. So I have a little more on that. We'll see how much time that takes us today. It could occupy a lot of the meeting, but we'll make sure to get through that. And then if we can, we'll start to talk about the next author that follows in this series. So first, I'll just try to do some general review to bring you guys back up to speed. So now we've reached this new topic in the semester, which is philosophy of mind. What that's all about is human consciousness and just consciousness in general. It's the study of consciousness. So consciousness, what is that? Well, it's what you have right now as you watch this meeting. It's the ability to see, hear, taste, tell, touch. It's all the five senses, right? It's perception, but it's also introspection, the ability to just think in your mind of random stuff, dreams, hopes, desires, pain, pleasure. So the entire internal life of the conscious being is what's being studied in the philosophy of mind. And the question is, what's the nature of consciousness? Is it something that's totally based on the physical brain? Or is there something about it that resists a purely physical analysis? Is there something like a soul or a non-physical basis for consciousness that does not depend on the physiological structure of the brain and nervous system? So there's different views about that on the question of whether or not consciousness is physical or non-physical. Those that are called monists, believing in monism, say that everything in the universe is made out of just one kind of substance. On the other hand, there are dualists, which they think that everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substances. And concerning monism, there are two basic varieties of monism, depending on which substance is the one they think makes everything. So the two substances that are kind of the eligible options are, number one, physical matter. Physical matter is just anything that occupies space. And the most minute element of physical matter is usually referred to as the atom. So some people believe that matter, physical matter, is the only substance that makes everything in the universe, including human beings and consciousness. So if you're a physicalist, as they are called, then you say everything's made out of matter, essentially. In other words, everything's made out of atoms, even me and you, and our consciousness. So according to physicalists, there's no such thing as the soul. There's no such thing as consciousness that could exist without a brain, because the brain really is the physical source of consciousness, according to physicalism. Other people believe in what's called idealism. It's not as widespread of a view anymore, but that's the idea that there is no matter and everything is just ideas all around you. So there's no real solid mass or, atomic physical matter building things up. It's just a bunch of ideas. But we don't really have many people that are big advocates of this anymore. So really, I just mentioned it so that you have the full picture of the options that are out there. But really, we're comparing physicalism with dualism. So what's dualism? It's the one that says there are two substances that make everything, and they embrace both matter and mind. Now, mind, as opposed to matter, is the other substance that sometimes is referred to. And mind, in the usage of the philosopher, is not the brain. It's instead something that has no extension in space, but is capable of thinking and having consciousness. So you got to think something of like a ghost, right? Like a soul that could, float free from the body and not necessarily occupy a body, but it still exists and it still has consciousness and thought. So some people believe that although there's matter, yes, even our body made out of physical matter, there's also this non-physical mind that is related to the body. And so that's dualism. Now, we're engaged in a series of articles now which try to discuss the differences and the arguments on the other side in favor of dualism, in favor of physicalism. So we started with the dualist position from René Descartes, and that brings us to the review of the notes that I was covering last time. So this is just to remind us of our author, René Descartes, and we're taking a look at some of the work from his book. By the way, he lived from 1596 to 1650, and his 1641 book, The Meditations, is our current text. In particular, we're looking at the 6th chapter of it, 6th meditation. And that's the last chapter of the book. Okay, so in this piece of the Meditations, Descartes lays out his big, complex argument for dualism. And I was trying to break it down for you guys when we ran out of time. So I'm going to put more of it on the board and also put the information that we had last time, so we'll kind of continue from there. So Descartes' argument for dualism. Okay, now there are many steps to this argument. We call these steps premises in logic and philosophy. Premises are just sort of the reasons or the evidence that's given to support the conclusion of the argument, and the conclusion is what you're trying to prove true. So I'm numbering off the premises in like a list, and it starts off with the first claim, which is that given the method of doubt, which we studied previously, the method of doubt which says to assume that something's false, if it's even possible for it to be false, if it's possible to doubt it, then just set it aside and continue on in that same way until you find something that can't be doubted. Well, anyway, based on the method of doubt, I can doubt everything perceived by the five senses and even math and logic. Okay, that first claim. Now, when you write these arguments out, don't just think, okay, I'm copying it down and I'll figure it out later. Like, think about it at each stage, right? So what is this saying and why? It's saying that because the method of doubt it tells you to assume to be false whatever can be doubted, everything you perceive by the five senses can be doubted, because it could be that you're dreaming, right? Maybe you're just having a big, long dream, or you're in the midst of a simulation or whatever. You're in the matrix. So since you can't rule that out, I guess, let's go ahead and suppose it's false. Based on the method of doubt, that can be doubted. Even math and logic, he said, could be doubted if, for example, there were like a mad scientist, evil demon type of thing implanting your brain, or I don't even know if you have a brain, but implanting you wherever you're at with this false information. So all these things can be doubted, but there's something that can't be doubted. And remember what that was? He said, despite all this doubt, one thing remains certain, and that is the knowledge that you exist, at least as a non-physical mind, because you are thinking. So despite this, I know for certain that I exist. At least as a non-physical mind, even if not as a body, because that's still subject to doubt. Because I'm thinking. Okay. So first two premises, the number one premise talks about all the things you can doubt based on this method, but the second premise talks about the one thing that you can't doubt even with the method, and that's the knowledge that you have that you exist. Even if nothing else is certain, you know you exist because you're thinking. So you have a mind, if not a body. And then the next thing is this. Okay, so since you're thinking, you have thoughts. Consider the inventory of thoughts that you do have. Well, many thoughts are there. You have thoughts of like college, universities, classrooms, computers, but you also have a thought of God, right? So he says, in my mind are thoughts, including the idea of God. In my mind, there's ideas, including the idea of God. Now, what about that idea? He zeroes in on that for a minute, and he says, okay, well, about the idea of God, it's special, it's unique. It's unique because of all the ideas you have, it's the one and only idea of something that he says that is infinite. So he says the idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Unique because it's the idea of an infinite being. All right, so given that, I think this camera will show the next column here. So 1 through 4. The fifth premise we can say is this. So since the idea of God is the idea of something infinite, he says that can only come from some source which has infinite reality. I tried to explain this by means of like a metaphor of two containers, right? If container B holds a gallon, and we are just told that it received it from container A, then container A clearly must have greater than or equal to a gallon of capacity to give to B. So if you're a mind, in your head, there's an idea of something infinite. That idea is coming into your mind from some source, and whatever the source is would have to be able to support the idea, so it would have to have an infinite reality. Therefore, he says, since the idea of God is of an infinite being, it must be caused by something that has infinite reality, and therefore God exists. Okay, so fifth premise. Okay, and so God exists. Why? Because he's saying that it's the only possible cause of the idea of God that we have. So since the idea is there, he attributes it to the existence of God because he does not think that any other finite thing could have generated this idea of something infinite. So anyway then, God exists. Now what does that unlock? According to him, if God exists, which he now thinks he's proven in the course of the argument, since God exists, he's not a deceiver. He's perfectly good, so he would never deceive. So since God exists, he's not a deceiver, which means that we can trust those things that are clear and distinct. So since God exists and is known to be infinitely good, omnibenevolent. Since God exists and is known to be infinitely good, he is not a deceiver. May I ask a question about something? I want to know the wording that I may have used for premise 7 in the last meeting. I don't know if you have clear notes or a good memory, but I'm wondering whether or not I condensed this statement together with the information that therefore we can trust our clear and distinct perceptions. Was this part of it? Maybe? Someone can tell me? Anyone here in this chat?
He would not deceive us when we have clear and distinct.
Okay, so since God exists and is known to be infinitely good, he is not a deceiver. And what does it say?
When we have clear and distinct.
Okay, so when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. Okay, good. He's not a deceiver, which means that when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. I could have broken that up into two, I guess, but anyway, there's the full statement. Since God exists and he is known to be omnibenevolent, that means he's not a deceiver, which means that when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they've got to be true. Okay, so let me try and break that down just a bit. And Grant, thank you for your comment. Since God exists and is perfectly good, he would not deceive us when we have clear and distinct perceptions. Good. Slight rewording, but it's the same information here. Okay, because I'm not going off of like strict notes that they're word for word. I'm giving you the argument, which can be said in a few different ways, but it's the same content. Okay, so anyway, what is premise 7 saying? Once he believes he's reached the point of argument where he's established a proof of God's existence, he says, well, consider what kind of being God is. God is thought to be the greatest conceivable being, including in his greatness that he's perfectly good and just. So if he's perfectly good, righteous, and just, then he's not going to do anything that's contrary to good, including to be deceptive. So since he's this good, non-deceptive being, this means that when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they've got to be true. Because imagine if they weren't. Imagine if right now, like you think you're watching a lecture and stuff, but you're just dreaming and this is all a big fake illusion. If that was the case, then God would really be messing with you. He would be setting you up just to get everything wrong. And that would be to build these creations in his image that are just walking around all day with a complete false picture of reality. That would not be honest. That would not be sincere or good. So what Descartes thinks we can trust then is that the most obvious things that are so clear, now we actually can trust those things and say that they're true because God wouldn't have it otherwise. God would not have it where, you're living in an illusion and everything is just a false appearance. So that's why now he will say that clear and distinct perceptions can be trusted. He was not prepared to say it at the beginning of the meditations, but through this long process of argument, he believes that he's proved God exists, and that gives him this leverage to say that what's most clear and distinct can now really be trusted as guaranteed by God. But we're not quite done yet, okay? So what are these clear and distinct perceptions? He says there's a few of them now that we can, bank on and that we can take to be totally certain. One of these clear and distinct perceptions is the following point. He says, among my clear and distinct perceptions is this, that if two things can be clearly imagined as existing separately, then those are two actually separate things in reality. Okay, let me write that here. Among my clear and distinct perceptions is the knowledge that if two things can be clearly imagined as existing separately, let's say conceived of, okay, so that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, like apart from each other, check my spelling, separately with an A, yeah. Okay, so that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then in that case, they really are two separate things. And then there's just two more little last steps. Step 9. Well, let me pause for a moment to make sure that's clear. Okay. So what does premise 8 say? It says this, that something that's clear and distinct is this idea that whenever you can imagine two things being separated and existing apart from each other, that guarantees that they actually can be separate things and that therefore they are not essential to each other. Let me give you a quick example based on something right here. So you see this wrist with this wristwatch, right? So I'm wearing a watch. It's on my wrist. This is an easy one. Tell me this. Can you imagine clearly me and the watch being separated? Like being in two separate places? Can you clearly imagine that? I mean, do I really have to demonstrate it for you to know that that's possible? Not really. You can clearly imagine it. So even if I leave the watch on for the rest of my life, you can clearly conceive in the mind of a scenario where I take it off and it's somewhere else. Look, I'll just demonstrate. Here it is. Watch is off. So now watch is over here and my body's over here. We're separated. So I showed you the real possibility that was advanced by your ability to conceive of it. So it's not just this one watch example, though. The point being made here is that that's general. If there's ever two things that you can imagine existing apart from each other, then even if they're connected or mingled together for now, they don't have to be. So like you see the snow on top of a mountain, it's going to be there. It's going to stay there. But you can at least theoretically conceive of the snow all being removed off and the mountain stays there. So that means that the snow and the mountain, although they're touching, they're not the same object. They're separate things, okay? So it's like that's a general point. Even if you had some things that are hard to disentangle, like say that you put a bunch of salt in some hot water and then it melts, so now it's salt water. You could desalinize the water by boiling it and separating the content of salt from the water. So even if sometimes it would be hard and tricky to disentangle and divide two things that are currently somehow mixed together, if it's possible to conceive of, it could really happen. And by the way, Descartes says, well, I've proven that God exists. So even if it would be hard for a human being perhaps to divide some of the things that are mixed together, God with his almighty power could just do it through his will at any time. So given this, which it says that if two things can be imagined as existing separately, then they really are. What do you think he's going to say next? Well, it gets us right towards dualist conclusion. The next thing he'll say is that these two things can clearly be imagined as existing separately. And by the way, we've already imagined them to exist separately in the earlier meditations when we contemplated that maybe we're dreaming and stuff. So what are these two big things that you think he'll say can clearly be imagined as existing apart from each other here at the bottom? That's my question for you. What will be your intuition? Where will this argument go next? So I can clearly imagine these two things existing separately, so they're separate. That's right, Ellie, the mind and body. So in our chat, you'll see that. Mind and body. So let me add that to the list. I can clearly conceive of my mind and body existing separately. And by the way, as illustrated prior in the earlier meditations, because remember, if we're all dreaming, suppose that was real, then right now maybe you don't even have this body. Like maybe this body's a dream, and so you don't even have one. So it's possible for you to imagine the case where you're just a mind dreaming it all, and maybe you don't have a body, or the body that you do have could cease to exist while you keep thinking. So anyway, number 9, I can clearly conceive of my mind and body existing separately. So conclusion, okay, when you get to the bottom line of an argument and you're like going to say the whole final conclusion, one standard formatting is to draw a line, and underneath the horizontal line, the conclusion is below. So this shows like there's a list of premises all leading towards this final conclusion, kind of like in math, right? When you've done horizontal math sums and stuff, like 2 + 2 is 4, right? So like that's the result. These are the factors that lead to it. So in a similar kind of logical format, we see here's the conclusion, and what is the conclusion? It's just that therefore, the mind and the body are two separate things. And that's what dualism says, so the conclusion is dualism. Okay, so little compressed at the bottom. Legibility's not perfect, but I'll read it so it's easy to know. It says, the mind and body are two separate things. That's what that last little piece there says. Okay, so reviewing the whole argument then, looking it over one last time. It's an argument which attempts, as you can see in the end, to prove the claim that the mind and the body are not the same, that we have a mind that's different from the body, that can exist completely separated from this body. And how does the argument proceed? Beginning with the method of doubt, it claims that utilizing the method of doubt, so much is subject to doubt because, you could be dreaming or you could be deceived by some deceiver. But one thing that cannot be doubted is that you yourself exist as a mind on the very simple basis that you're thinking at all. So you have a mind. Okay, that's something to work with. What's next? Well, you have ideas in the mind. And in the mind, the ideas that you have include all kinds, but one is the idea of God. He pulls that out for special attention. He says, okay, well, that's special because it's the idea of an infinite being. And how could you get that idea if it didn't come from something that was infinite, right? So that's his way of trying to make the case that there's a God, because, again, he thinks it's the only possible explanation for how you have an idea of God. So you have an idea of God, that means God exists. Well, what is God? He's a perfect being who's infinitely good. And if that's true, he would never deceive us, at least not about the things that are the most clear and obvious. So those things we can just place confidence in, finally, saying that we know they're true because the perfectly good, benevolent God wouldn't want us to be deceived about them. And consider what are the clear and distinct perceptions. There's a few, but one of them that he mentions here is that if two things can be clearly imagined as existing separated, then they really are separate things, as given in the example of me and the watch, but you can imagine other possible cases too. The wheels on a tire, I don't know, they're part of the car, I guess, but they're not the same object itself. They can be divided from it and exist separately. So I can clearly conceive of the mind and body existing separately, as noted in the earlier meditations. So that must mean that they're really two separate things. Maybe you guys have heard of weird cases of people that have had like near-death experiences, and they're saying like, oh, I had this, it was really intense. At the, hospital after this traumatic head injury, they were all working on me, and I started to feel like I was floating above and looking at my body down below. I'm not trying to say that that's the only example, but that's the kind of examples that are mentioned in thinking of the imaginability of the mind and the body existing separately. So Descartes does believe that your mind and body are separate, and that even if the body's destroyed, the mind can still exist. Let me read some of the quotes here, and you'll be able to see how he puts it in his own way. On page 556, on the left column, I think this is a good quote that gives insight into his argument. He says, first, I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Therefore, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. The question of what kind of power is required to bring about the separation does not affect the judgment that the two things are distinct. Thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I'm a thinking thing, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I'm a thinking thing. It is true that I may have a body that is very closely joined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing, and on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing, and accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body, and I can exist without it. Okay, so this is the argument for dualism from Descartes. It's really based around conceivability, the idea that it's clearly conceivable for the mind and the body to exist separately, and that in itself suffices to guarantee that they can be separated, because God doesn't want us to have clear and distinct perceptions that turn out to be false. Now, having laid out this big argument for dualism, there's a little bit more content of the paper, or the essay. So let me add a few more points. Once we have all this, I guess now I can clear it away. So he says there's also like a couple of other clear and distinct perceptions that we can add back into our certainty, which was initially kind of threatened by the method of doubt overall. So other clear and distinct perceptions that he now says we can be sure of. not even right. Okay, clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, so other clear and distinct perceptions. Another one is this, that the external world exists. It's not just a big hologram or a simulation, but it's real. And that's clear, he says, but he'll give you reasons why. The external world exists. Like reality is real. It's not just a figment of your imagination. And why is this clear and distinct? Okay, he says this is clear and distinct for a couple of basic reasons. This is clear and distinct because, okay, now let me try and make it somewhat reasonable. Why is it so clear and distinct that the external world exists? Well, one reason is this. If it was a dream, and I'm a dreamer having this big dream, then you would expect that I would be able to exert more control over the things happening, right? But that's not that's of course not how it works. So I can't like summon and manifest desired outcomes by just hoping and wishing that they happen. Because otherwise I would say right now, I don't know, make it so that when I get back to my car, there's like a big giant bag of money in there of unmarked bills and it's just mine. So that's what's going to happen today. Or I would say, make someone give me a great gift, later today. Just a rich person's like, hey, do you need a check? I'm a philanthropist. I see you're a great philosopher or something and you're helping these kids. So let me give you $1 million. That, I would make up stuff and it would just happen, right? But that's not how things work. So number one, I cannot perceive only that which is favorable. And you would have expected that if the world was some kind of dream or illusion, that I could shape it to my will, which I'm not able to do. That's why are we all wearing masks, right? I wouldn't want this if I had my way, if I could choose how reality is. So anyway, I cannot perceive only that which is favorable. And that gives evidence that the world is not subject to my control and my will because it's not made up by me. So I cannot perceive only what is favorable to me. Another thing is this, like, right, if the world was a dream and I'm the dreamer, then if I lost something, I would probably just find it right away. I'd be like, okay, make sure that it's in my bag so that I don't have to look for my phone or my charging cable, right? But instead, no, I lose it, never see it again, and I just end up frustrated. If this world was subject to my desires and control of the mind, then it would be completely conformable to my interests. A second thing is this, and it's kind of related but slightly different. I cannot control what I perceive, okay? Even whether it's favorable or not, I don't have control over the items I'm perceiving in my perception. And that gives reason to think that the external world is objective and not subjective. So I cannot control what I perceive. For example, right now, in the space in front of you, if you're watching live stream, or you guys here in the classroom, try and see a platypus just right there. Just perceive it, see it. Now you can imagine it in your head, but you can't manifest the object in space like a hologram right here. So if the world was something made up by the mind, then you would expect that you can cause things to pop in and pop out just by thinking enough about it, right? So make that desk disappear, or make an object that you don't see in the room appear now. But you can't do that. So that shows that there's an external reality that's not just shaped by the intent and the desire of the will that the person has. So I cannot control what I perceive. I certainly can't just make my perceptions all favorable. And here's a third one that's kind of interesting and a little tricky. The third reason that this is clear and distinct, he says, is because memories, if you think about memories, they're less vivid and sharp than the current perceptions are, okay? So memories are less vivid than current perception. Okay, less vivid memories are than the current perception is. So let's do a little comparison. I want you to think back to, I don't know, something that you were doing back in the beginning of the year. Remember New Year's? Okay, go back in your mind and think of that memory. Now compare that to what's happening right now, all right? Now, everyone's got, a little bit different in terms of how sharp their memory is. Some people are more forgetful than others. But basically, whether you are a perfect memory or not, I bet you that you think that this experience that you're having in the present moment is a little bit more detailed and rich and clear than your faded out memories of what you were doing on New Year's. And as you go back further and further in time, the memories get even less sharp and distinct, right? You lose a lot of details. But right now, this is so sharp. I mean, you're in the environment. You can feel the things that are in the environment. You can hear the voice of the speaker. You can see the things that you're looking at. So current perception is like happening live. And past memories are faded out copies of what you had experienced before, unless you're watching an actual video that's a recording of it. But anyway, the recording of the mind is less sharp, isn't it, than the current perception is. Now, what could possibly explain that? The only thing that could explain that is if there really is an external reality. Because if everything was a dream, right, there would be no loss of accuracy and clarity from the original perception to the later one, because both would be like illusions and mental phenomena. The only thing that can explain the drop off of clarity is that when you're having the current perception, you're in the presence of the objects externally that are giving you the perception. And when you're trying to remember them later, you're trying to represent in the mind's eye things that were previously perceived when that was happening. So we can only explain the loss of vividness and clarity according to the hypothesis that there's an external reality, which is more vivid when you're in its environment and less vivid when you're trying to recall it later. Okay, we wouldn't see that difference and distinction if both cases were just having thoughts instead of having perceptions versus having thoughts. Okay, so that's another reason to think there really is an external world. So now Descartes, who really kind of shakes people up in the beginning of his book by saying, hey, maybe this is all a dream. Do you really know if this is real? Now he's like, just kidding. Actually, it is certain, but I had to do some work to show you that. I had to show this case that God exists. And then if that is certain, and we can be assured of the things that are clear and distinct, here's something that's clear and distinct, and here are reasons why. One more thing he says that's clear and distinct now is this, that I have a body. Okay, so the external world exists, but what about you having a physical body? Now he says that's also clear and distinct. So another clear and distinct perception, I have a body. Now this is clear and distinct for a few reasons also. But let's see if you can come up with a reason. I mean, we'll take a moment here with you. Now, this is a question that I'm sure people have never asked you. How do you know you've got a body? Because most people are like, that's an insane question. But whatever. This is philosophy, so that's what we're going to ask. What if I ask you, how do you know you've got a body? What would be your explanation to that person? How do you know? I mean, think about it. What makes you certain? What reason do you think? You're going to, okay, don't just be like, I could see it. Say something else. Like what? If I don't let you say I can see it, then you still can say reasons. There still are reasons. If I don't just say, oh, it's there and it's visible. What are the other reasons that it's clear? You have a body, right? So how do you know that? Now you're stumped. You're like, well, actually, I have no knowledge as to how I know it. It's just something I take for granted. Go ahead. Let me think about it with you. Okay, so that's good, Alex, right? Here in the chat, you say, I have control over it. Exactly, that's one of the reasons that he mentioned. So let me put it on the board. He says, I can control the movements and actions of this body, but not of others. So I can control this body with my mind, right? Like, watch, I'm going to make the finger snap. There it happens, because I thought of it. But I can't look at you and be like, his fingers will snap or her fingers will snap, because I'm in a different body. So the locus of control that I hold over this physical specimen shows that it's mine. So that's one reason. I can control this body with my mind, but not others. Okay, thought leads to action with this body. If I think something, it's going to happen, and I'll make it happen with my own physical behavior, but I can't do the same with others. So that's good. And Ryan, you say you need a body to carry out a conversation with someone. Correct. But we're talking about the internal aspects that you can only sort of derive from your experience. So Drew, another good one. You say, I feel it. That's also good. And so that's another point that he mentions. He says, you experience sensations when a stimulus is applied to your body, but not to others. Okay, so like if I do this right now and pinch my arm a little bit, that hurts a little, but you don't feel it, okay, because it's not a stimuli applied to your body. Now, if you are, injured or cold or hot or something, you can report that to me, and I can kind of empathize with you. But unless I'm affected by the same stimuli, it's not something that's happening to me. So, like, if you get, I don't know, like an injury, like a knee scrape or something, I can look at it and say that must hurt, but it's not that when it happens to you, I feel the pain of you. So I experience sensations when stimuli is applied to this body, but not others, which is another reason to think that it is mine and that I am the possessor of it. Okay, so okay, and then the third one is this. It's kind of funny almost. The third one is just that I can't like get away from this body. I can't move away. I can't separate from it, but I can separate from any other body or object in space. So like, social distancing, get away from me. I could get away from everybody else, but I can't separate from myself, obviously. I mean, I guess you can imagine a person rip limb from limb, but that's not really what we're talking about. Like I can't astral project and teleport away while my body stays back and I'm like, like roving around free from the body. So that's not possible. At least not until you die, I guess, according to Descartes, because the mind and the body are distinct. But as long as we're alive, they're mingled together. So the third one is that I cannot separate myself from this body, unlike all the others. Okay, so these are three different reasons that it is so clear and distinct to say you have a body. About number two, it's kind of funny. If this body wasn't yours and it was just something that like the mind somehow is like riding along in, like a sailor on a ship, then you wouldn't necessarily experience pain when something happens that harms the body, right? If a cannonball hits the ship, the captain doesn't say, ouch, ow, because it's not a part of his body, right? But if the cannonball hits, well, the cannonball's a little big, but if a projectile hits the sailor or the captain, now that hurts him. So there's a difference between being a passenger on a car or ship and having a body, because although the body and mind are distinct, according to Descartes' argument, they're mingled together while we live, and we have a special connection to the one body that you are assigned, I guess, since you experience sensations with respect to it, you can control it, and you can't separate yourself from it, except in the ultimate sense of death. So more reasons that it's clear and distinct that you have a body. So now Descartes is filling back in the gaps of like lost certainty that the method of doubt began with. We can now say it's certain that the world exists, that it basically is similar to the way we perceive it, and our own body exists. And so there are also other minds, and our basic conception of reality is generally accurate. Does this mean that we can never make mistakes? No. Descartes is careful about that. He says it's only the clear and distinct perceptions that God guarantees to be true. But if we have vague and confused perceptions, like we're drunk on drugs, looking at optical illusions or something, going off of bias or emotion, those would not be clear and distinct perceptions. So God's not responsible for errors with respect to those. That's on us. But he makes sure that we have the ability to discover the truth, because according to Descartes, he's outfitted us with the tools we need to get to the truth if we just do things carefully and if we wait for things to be clear and distinct before judging them. Let me read some quote at the very end here of his book, and he kind of says this. He says, it is quite clear from all this that notwithstanding the immense goodness of God, the nature of man, as a combination of mind and body, is such that he is bound to mislead from time to time, because there may be some occurrence. So let me tell you a little backstory. He talks here about phantom limb pain, which I think is kind of fascinating because in 1641, when he wrote the book, I didn't even know that there was enough knowledge medically of the phenomenon. But a phantom limb pain is when a person, let's say, loses a body part, a limb, and then they still have this strange sensation of like pain, ticklishness, or just sensations in the limb that's no longer there. And so Descartes says, will you tell me that this is God deceiving the person because he makes it seem like, my arm hurts or itches, but there's no arm at all? Descartes says that no, this is like a misfire of the typical processes of the nervous system. He thinks that the feeling of the missing body part is caused by exciting of the nerve at higher points along the nerve cord that runs up to the brain. And so he just thought the system is working as it should in like 99% of cases, but because of this strange accident, it's causing this misperception. Nonetheless, he says that God has given you memory and reason, so that could overcome the illusion of phantom limb pain, informing you that although you obviously don't have an arm, and since you have suffered an accident, that you shouldn't interpret it as like the arm is still there. And that's what he says in this quote. He says, there may be some occurrence not in the foot, but in the other areas through which the nerves travel in their route from the foot to the brain. And if this cause produces the same motion which is generally produced by injury to the foot, then pain will be felt as if it was in the foot. This deception of the senses is natural because a given motion in the brain must always produce the same sensation in the mind. And the origin of the motion in question is much more often going to be something which is hurting the foot rather than is something elsewhere. So he's really bending over backwards to try and bat away any objections that, God actually does allow us to be deceived about things that are clear and distinct. So he takes the case of phantom limb pain as his example to say that even there, it's kind of more our fault if we reach the false conclusion that we have a problem with the limb that's not there anymore. Finally, at the end, he goes back to the question of whether we're dreaming everything. And he has some interesting comments as to why it's clear now that we're not dreaming. Consider how dreams work, guys. When you have real dreams, they're episodic. They don't tie together in one long narrative like a Netflix series or something. Like, can't wait for the next episode when I go to sleep tonight. So they are random and disconnected. But waking life is all ordered together, right? You guys are here today because you signed up for this class like months ago. And you'll be here on Friday because it's a next installment of the lecture series. And so your life and the sequence of events in your life are connected into one big kind of continuous narrative, unlike the episodic and random one-off experiences that you have in dreams. So he says that that kind of connectedness between the moments of waking life gives reason to think it's real and not an illusion. That's what he says here. He says, I notice now that there is a vast difference between being awake and asleep, in that dreams are never linked by memory with all the other actions of life as waking experiences are. If while I am awake, anyone was suddenly to appear to me and then disappear immediately like it does happen in sleep, so that I could not see where they had come from or where they had gone, it would not be unreasonable for me to judge that he was a ghost or a hallucination created by my brain rather than a real person. But when I distinctly see where things come from and where they are and where they go, and when I can connect my perception of it with the whole rest of my life with no break, then I'm quite certain that when I encounter these things, I am not asleep, but I am awake. And I should not have even the slightest doubt of their reality, because from the fact that God is not a deceiver, it follows that in cases like these, I am completely free from error. But since the pressure of things to be done does not always allow me to stop and make a meticulous check, it must be admitted that in this human life, we are often liable to make mistakes about particular things. And that just means we have to acknowledge the weakness of our nature. So he says, when we make errors in judgment, it's due to our own fallibility, not the mismanagement of our situation by God. So really, I mean, that's pretty much it. I could tell you a little bit more. He distinguishes these two faculties of the mind. That's one other thing I guess I'll briefly say here to just finalize all the material from Descartes. And then we'll really get started with Daniel Stolzer on Friday. So we're only, I think, one meeting behind overall. And I can easily delete something if needed later, but we'll try to catch up in the meantime. Okay, so last thing I want to say about Descartes. In the midst of this whole discussion of mind and body, he says that there's two different abilities of the mind. There's imagination and understanding. So imagination is when you represent in the mind's eye things that were previously perceived by the senses. Okay, so to represent in the mind things that were previously perceived by the senses. And he says that that faculty of the mind is more closely related to our physical or bodily aspect. Okay, so he says this is more closely related to our bodily aspect. Because why is that? Because you need the physical body to perceive things. You need the sense organs. You need eyes, ears, nose, tongue, hands, and so on. But imagination is when the mind takes and collects those things that were previously perceived through one of those senses, and then allows them to be like contemplated later on. Sometimes when you think of imagination, you think of images, and that's fair. Like right now, you can imagine, I don't know, an astronaut walking around on Mars. And that's a picture in the head, right? But you can also imagine like a song that you've heard before, which is not as an auditory memory. You can imagine, I guess, it's kind of hard to do, but like the smell of something. So at any rate, when you have sensation, you can recall those things later through imagination. Understanding, though, is a little different. Understanding is just pure abstract contemplation of ideas in the mind with no imagery associated. Okay, so pure contemplation of ideas. With no imagery or other sensory information, etc. And he says that this part of the ability of the mind, this is more closely related to our mental mind aspect, non-physical aspect. And he says the fact that we have these two faculties, abilities of the mind, is further evidence that we really are divided into both body and mind, and that we're not just one or the other. So like to show the difference between the two, one example is consider a triangle. If I ask you to imagine a triangle, you're imagining like that three-sided polygon figure. But that's not really to fully understand the triangle, because to understand it, you would have to know facts about geometry, that the interior angles all amount to 180 degrees. You'd have to know things about like Pythagoras' theorem, the hypotenuse, and all of that. So understanding the triangle it requires a different mental act than just thinking of the picture. Like even a dog or a cat can think of the image, I guess, or see the image, perceive the image of the triangle, but could not understand its geometric properties. So knowing that we can, on the one hand, just entertain images and ideas that are in the imagination, and on the other hand, contemplate something like in a pure conceptual, abstract sense, he thinks that shows that we're both mind and body. And so back to imagination, last thing, it represents previously perceived things, but sometimes it can recombine things that were never perceived in the first place. If I tell you to imagine a purple cow standing on the moon, I know you've never actually seen that, but what have you seen? You've seen cows, you've seen the color purple, images of the lunar surface, so you can like creatively recombine those elements in the mind to form the imaginary scene. And that's kind of how imagination works. Sometimes it's a straight memory, sometimes it's like a creative reinterpretation of particular items that have been perceived. But knowing that that's one ability of the mind to form images based on the past perceptions, and another is just to contemplate stuff, he thinks that's yet another reason to believe that although we're most fundamentally the mind, because the body, of course, is temporary, we're still a dualist conception of reality where there's mind and body. Okay, so that's everything then from today's Descartes lecture. We're done with that. And then we'll spend most of the rest of our meetings for the next week talking about the other position, which is physicalism and materialism. So hang in there for that one. And for now, I guess I'll just close the meeting. So let me see everyone. Are you good to go? Let me know, and then I'll just end the stream. And we'll be back on Friday. So how is that? Are we all right? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Drew, and everybody else. I'll be in touch if you need anything. So until next time, have a good one, and I'll see you then. Goodbye. Okay, guys. Thank you so much.